Hello, and welcome back to the Insight LSAT Mini LSAT Prep Course. This is Lesson 3, and today we're going to be talking about the logical reasoning section of the LSAT, sometimes referred to as the argument section. In this lesson, I'm going to present to you a very powerful strategy for dealing with pretty much all of the question types. This is going to be an effective approach for dealing with this section. And then we're going to dig in deeper and look at each of the major question types and talk about specific strategies for those. Let's get to it. There are actually going to be two logical reasoning sections on any given LSAT exam. There could be three if your experimental section is a logical reasoning, but of course only two will be scored. And it's always the case that one of these sections, one of the two LR sections, is going to be a little bit easier and the other one is going to be a little bit harder. It's important to know that while you're preparing, just so you don't think that your progress is bouncing up and down as you're drilling LR sections. When you're taking practice tests, just be aware that all LR sections are not equal. One is going to be a little tougher, one's going to be a little bit easier. And in each of these sections, you're going to be given 35 minutes to answer 24 to 26 questions. And each of these questions is going to be broken down into two parts. First, you'll be given a little blurb, a short paragraph or a short block of text that tells you something. Usually it introduces a short argument, but it could also just tell you some information. And then you're given a question about that bit that you just read. The question will have 5 answer choices, and you're supposed to pick the one that best answers the question. Almost always, there's only one question per blurb, but on occasion there will be 2 questions for one blurb, and it will say it very clearly. It'll say, refer to the following passage for questions 24 and 25, whatever it is. But the vast majority of times, it's going to be one blurb presenting an argument followed by a question. And here's an example of a very typical logical reasoning question. It'll start up here with a blurb, not too long, see? Then there's a question, and then there's some answer choices. Now let's talk strategy for these LR questions. This is going to be general strategy that you can apply to any question type. It's just a general approach for dealing with this section. First point, you want to actually read the question first before you read the blurb. And I know that's a little bit counterintuitive, but trust me, it is the best way of doing things. The reason is that once you read the question, you know how you're supposed to read this blurb. If you just jump into the blurb and you let the information flow over you, you're just trying to get a sense of what's going on, you're going to read the question and then you're going to find out what the question's about, and you're going to have to go back and read it again to do the particular task that this question is asking of you. But if you read the question first, you know the mindset that you're supposed to have reading the blurb. So take a look at this one here. The reasoning in the argument above is vulnerable to criticism on the grounds that it... So we know from reading this little question stem here that we are looking for a problem with the blurb, some error in reasoning, some flaw in the reasoning. So when we go back and read the blurb, we're not looking for the structure of the argument necessarily to find out what a particular sentence does in the argument. We're not looking for hidden assumptions necessarily. We are looking specifically for errors in this reasoning, and that's a particular way of approaching the blurb. There are many ways you can approach the blurb, and you can't do them all at once. So read the question first and know what you're doing when you go read the blurb. That brings us to our second point. Once you've read the question, go back and read the blurb carefully and critically. Don't forget the logic lessons from lesson 2. You should be constantly having that background logical structure in mind. You have to have this LSAT way of reading the entire time. And granted, like I just said, the questions will ask you to do particular tasks, but they're all tasks that involve something to do with logic, right? You're evaluating the logic in one way or another. You're trying to understand the logic in one way or another. So don't forget what we did in lesson 2. This is where you're going to apply it. And one thing that's pretty generally applicable to each question is it's good to understand what the conclusion is of the blurb when you read through it. It's kind of like an orienting point for the rest of your understanding. Once you read a blurb, you should be able to find the conclusion because just like we did in lesson 2, it's going to enable you to understand the way the rest of the text relates to the conclusion, relates to the argument. So, second point, read the blurb carefully and critically, thinking about logic. Third point, once you get to the answer choices, once you've read the question, then you've moved up to the blurb and read it carefully and in a focused way, you're going to look at the answer choices. And you're going to attack these choices from wrong to right. You're going to cross out answer choices as you see that they're incorrect. You're not just glancing through and trying to find the correct answer, because if you do that, you might get tricked by an answer that's almost right or that looks pretty good. Instead, you want to look for each answer to be wrong. You want to find something that spoils it, that ruins that answer. And you want to consider these answers guilty until proven innocent. So be really critical, assume they're wrong, because 4 out of 5 of them are wrong, and then knock out each wrong one until you're down to the right one. Now, usually there's one question that is right, and then there'll be a second question that's pretty close. Usually you can knock it down to 2 once you are a little bit practiced. A couple other ones will be pretty obviously wrong, and then you're going to have usually 2 that are in the running. Then you have to get really careful and look at each of them because one of them is definitely wrong. The LSAT is not really a test that involves a lot of subjective judgments. There's going to be a good reason for why one of them is actually wrong. You just have to be really critical at that point once you've narrowed it down to 2. And our last point of strategy, once you feel confident that you have the correct answer, you want to double check it with an eye toward precise language. So you want to really focus in on that answer and make sure that each and every word in that answer is okay, right? Each part of the answer allows it to be read as a correct answer given what's read above. Usually what's going to make an answer wrong, or what's going to make the difference between 2 decent looking answers, is just one word. One little bit of the answer choice that just does something wrong. Maybe it's too strong, maybe it's just not quite correct, but there's usually one word or a couple words that ruin it, so you have to have an eye toward precise language. So that's your general strategy for approaching any question on the LR section. Now I want to talk about specific question types and some of the more particular nuanced strategies that apply to them. So in this part of the lesson, we're going to introduce each of the major question types by showing an example of it, and then we're going to talk a little bit about strategies for that question type. We're going to actually do the question. I'm going to have you pause the video each time and try to do the question, and then I'm going to walk you through it slowly, explaining why each wrong answer is wrong and explaining why the right answer is right. And then I'm going to present to you a list of homework questions for that question type. It's a good way, especially in the beginning, to practice question types by drilling the same type of question over and over and over. Better than just taking LR practice sections, you want to be focused on question types, doing the same one over and over and over so that you start to see the patterns that emerge in these types of questions. The LSAT tries to be tricky, but it's really not all that clever. They really have a handful of tricks that they just recycle over and over and over. And most of these, most questions of a given type are actually pretty much the same question, just with different content or subject matter. And the more you drill question types, the more you see the patterns that are really being tested by the LSAT. And once you've got an eye for this deeper logic in the LSAT, then you're really ready to perform really well. So let's go ahead and jump right into these question types. The first question type I want to talk about is called the structural analysis question. And an important note up front, even though there's a limited number of question types that are asked in the logical reasoning section, there are different ways of asking the same kind of question. Right? So if it's a flaw question, they may say something like the above argument is vulnerable to the criticism because it blanks. But they also might just say one flaw in the argument above is blanks. So what you're trying to do throughout this lesson is understand these question types, and then using the homework you'll be able to see the different ways the question types are presented. the different particular language that is used to present the question types. But what's most important is understanding that the LSAT's only going to ask you a limited number of things to do. So the first one we're going to talk about is structural analysis. And this is a question type in which you're going to be asked to focus in on that logical structure that we discussed at length in Lesson 2. Often it's going to be asking you about the role of a certain piece of text in the blurb, the role that that text is playing in the logical structure. So it might just ask you, which of the following is the main conclusion of the argument? And then you need to choose the answer that has the conclusion. But it might ask you something more specific. What is the role that blah blah blah, and it'll give a sentence. What is the role that blah 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 plays in the argument? And you might have to say it's support for the conclusion, or it's an intermediate conclusion. In any case, it's very important that with structural analysis questions, you are finding the conclusion first. No matter what it's asking you to find, you want to really find that conclusion first, because that's going to be, like I said before, orientation for you. Once you know the conclusion, all of the other bits of the argument should orient themselves around that conclusion in one way or another. You'll now see that maybe a certain piece of text is support for that conclusion, while another sentence is presenting the opposing point of view. But it's important to understand the larger structure rooted in the conclusion before you answer the question that the structural analysis question is going to ask you. Sometimes in a structural analysis question, there will actually be two arguments in the same blurb, and they'll be presented with different speakers. So it'll say very clearly Matt, colon, and then it will say something, and then Cindy, colon, and she'll say something. And they'll be in conversation with each other, and they'll ask something about the relationship between the two arguments. And a note about answer choices: sometimes the answers will be in general language, and sometimes it will be very specific. So in this case right here, it's all general language. So there's an example of general language. It just says A, it is the argument's conclusion. But sometimes, let's suppose that a question asks you, what is the role that so-and-so sentence plays in the argument? It may give specific language by saying it provides support for the conclusion that blah 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 blah. It will include specific language from the blurb in the answer choice. That's just two varieties, but it's all basically the same stuff. And the major roles that could be asked about in structural analysis, good to take note of them. The major roles are conclusions and intermediate conclusions, support for or against either of those things, support for the conclusion or something that challenges the conclusion, support for an intermediate conclusion or something that challenges an intermediate conclusion, or background information, which is another kind of role that can be played. So those were some general strategic points about structural analysis questions. Let's focus in on this particular example and try to work through it. This is a great time to pause the video and try to go through the question yourself and answer it, and then meet me back in just a couple of moments and I will walk you through it. Okay, remember our general strategy. We want to read the question first. Which one of the following most accurately describes the role played in the argument by the claim that relatively few people donate to charity, even though many claim that it is important? Alright, you can already see the importance of reading the question first. This question tells us to focus in on a particular claim and to think about the role that that claim is playing in the larger logical structure. We have a lot of guidance going into the blurb. Now let's take a look at the blurb. People's behavior is often inconsistent with their professed moral beliefs. Although many claim to believe that it is important to donate money to charity, relatively few actually give. Okay, so there's the part that we're supposed to hone in on, this second bit here. But we want to find the conclusion first so we can get our point of orientation. It's not immediately obvious to me which one is the conclusion. So maybe we'll try the so test. People's behavior is often inconsistent with their professed moral beliefs. So, although many claim to believe that it is important to donate money to charity, relatively few actually give. Not so sure. It didn't pop out so immediately to me, probably because this second bit is so long it's hard to hear it, and it's got this although phrase. The so test wasn't super helpful there. How about we think about what this argument is trying to prove to you or convince you of? That might be helpful. It's trying to convince you of something in here, and the rest of it's going to be support that makes that argument more convincing. So, is this little blurb trying to convince us that although many claim to believe that it is important to donate money to charity, relatively few actually give? How would you convince someone of something like that? What kind of evidence would you provide to them? It seems like you'd have to provide them some statistics about um, what people's donation habits are, and maybe some questionnaire results about what they claim to believe. Those are the kind of pieces of evidence that, if presented to me, would support this kind of claim here, would make this a more convincing claim. But that's not going on in this argument. How about the other one? How would you convince somebody that people's behavior is often inconsistent with their professed moral beliefs? In that case, you'd want to refer to examples in which people act inconsistently with their professed beliefs. And that's what this is. This is an example of people acting inconsistently. So, because of that, because it seems like this is the kind of evidence that supports this kind of claim, makes it more convincing, I'm going to say that this is the conclusion of the argument here. This is the main point of this blurb. People's behavior is often inconsistent with their professed moral beliefs. And then this would have to be support for that conclusion. Now let's take a look at the answer choices. A. It is the argument's conclusion. We're focused on the claim that relatively few people donate to charity, even though many claim that it is important. We already have an idea that it's support. But still, let's attack them wrong to right. Is the argument's conclusion? No, we already decided what the argument's conclusion is, and it's something else. It is evidence used to support an intermediate conclusion. Well, there actually is no intermediate conclusion in this argument, so that can't be it. This is one of those low-hanging fruit, easy to get rid of wrong answers. C. It conveys a point of view that opposes the point of view of the author. Nope. It's pretty consistent with the point of view of the author. There's actually only one point of view presented in this blurb, so that can't be it. D. It is used as evidence in support of the conclusion. That looks good. That's kind of what we anticipated. And E. It is an intermediate conclusion of the argument. Nope, there are no intermediate conclusions in the argument. So A was wrong, B was wrong, C was wrong, D looked pretty good, and it looked like what we anticipated, and E was definitely wrong, so D is your correct answer here, D. And here's your homework for structural analysis. Now there's going to be a slide like this for each question type, so let me teach you how to read it. Each of these bullets is a question. It's a question of the structural analysis type. And what this says here is this means that this first one comes from practice test 30. Remember, all the prep tests, all the practice tests are numbered officially by the Law School Admission Council. And this one is from prep test 30. It's in section 2 of the test, and it's question 7 within that section. Now, an easy way to just get to all these homework questions is to just use this page number here. And what this page number refers to is a book by the Law School Admissions Council. Remember, I talked about this in lesson 1. It refers to a book by the Law School Admissions Council. It's an official LSAT book, and it's called The Next 10 Actual Official LSAT Prep Tests. The Next 10 Actual Official LSAT Prep Tests. And it's an orange book. It's got a purple top, and it is one of the books in the Law School Admission Council's LSAT series. But you're looking for the next 10. That's what it's called. It's orange and purple. So if you get that book, all of the homework questions throughout this entire course will be from that book. You can just flip to the page number and do it. So, like I said before, drilling questions is a good way of doing this. I would focus on one question type at a time and really start to understand the different ways the questions can be asked, the different patterns that you see in the questions, the different patterns that you see in the answer choices, the patterns you see in the right answer choices, the patterns you see in the wrong answer choices. This is a great way to get a better understanding of the test. And also, these homework slides will give you a sense, depending on how many bullet points are on them, they'll give you a sense of how often these question types appear on an LSAT. So keep that in mind as well. Okay, take a screenshot of this, pause the video, whatever you've got to do. This is your homework for structural analysis. All right, moving right along to parallel structure, parallel flaw questions. This question type is going to present to you in the blurb an argument. And actually, there's going to be arguments in each of the answer choices as well. And the question is going to ask you to find the answer choice that has the same logical structure as the argument presented in the blurb. Sometimes it's going to be a flawed structure. There's going to be some problem with the logic. And in those cases, you just have to find the answer choice that has the same flawed structure as the flawed structure of the argument in the blurb. In general, it's useful to use symbolic logic for these kinds of questions in particular. The reason is that there's so much, these questions are so big. Look how many words are here. These questions are so big and there's so many details that you want to be able to reduce those details to the basic logical structure presented symbolically. So you can just see the skeleton of the argument in the blurb, and you can just see the skeletons of the answer choices. One of the answer choices will have the same skeleton as the blurb skeleton, and that's your right answer. These questions really test your ability to look past the content or the subject matter of the argument to the underlying logical structure, right? Because that is the thing that can be identical between two blurbs that are completely different in all other respects. So these two blurbs can have completely different subject matter, but they can have the same underlying logical skeleton. And these types of questions are testing your ability to see through the content to that structure. Remember your lessons from lesson 2. Remember that logic we did. This is really where it gets applied. So go ahead and pause your video now. When you get back, I'm going to use symbolic logic to work through this problem. So I suggest you do that also, especially in the beginning when you're practicing. Maybe later on you might not need to. You'll be able to see the parallel structure a little bit more easily, or you'll be able to see why wrong answers lack some element or have some extra element or some other way aren't parallel. But for now, I do recommend using symbolic logic to see clearly the skeletons that underlie these blurbs. So go ahead and pause your video, and I'll be back in just a moment to walk you through this. Alright, here we go. Every time the town raises taxes, the population decreases. Remember how we do this? We try to find a variable that can stand in for each logical chunk. So I'm going to put an R here for raises taxes. I'll put a D here for decreases. If the town raises taxes, the population decreases. The mayor just announced next year's budget. Okay, I'm not so sure that's going to actually have a role in the logical structure. It might just be background information. But let's put a B for budget just in case. And taxes are going to increase. Okay, that means the same thing as increasing taxes over here or raising taxes over here. So I'm just going to say R again. Therefore, it's indicating a conclusion, we should expect to see a population decrease next year. Okay, that's the D here, population decrease, D. Okay, so the larger structure then is every time R, D. If R, then D. Yeah, B doesn't really fit in here. Doesn't have any role in the logical structure. Then we have the fact that R, a mere assertion that R is the case, and an application of that over here is to conclude from R, D. If the town raises taxes, the population decreases. The town's going to raise taxes, therefore the population is going to decrease. That's your skeleton for the argument in the blurb. Now let's take a look at the answer choices. A. Every beaver knows how to build a dam across a river. Okay, it's a disguised if-then. if something is a beaver, then it knows how to build a dam. But this animal is not a beaver. Wait a minute, not a beaver. Okay, remember what I said in lesson 2 about negation? We have to include that in our logical structure. So this one is going to have to be not B. But immediately, once we put that, we know that A is not the right answer. Why? Think about this for a second. Why can't A be the right answer if it's got this negation in it? Because there's no negation in the blurb up here. There's no negation in the top part. And a negation is an important part of a logical structure. So if there's no negation in this skeleton, and there's going to be one in this one, let's not waste our time. This is the wrong answer. Moving on to B. The population of the city will increase only if the school system improves. Uh-oh. Only if. Remember from lesson 2? Only ifs are necessary conditions. But in our blurb, we have a sufficient condition. Remember, if-then statements are sufficient condition, and only if statements are necessary condition. Those are different structural elements. So there are no necessary conditions in the blurb, and there's already one presented here in the B. B cannot be right. Just one element out of place, or one extra element, is enough to throw off the answers in a parallel structure question. C. Every item purchased from our company comes with a gift receipt that allows for easy returns. Okay, another disguised if-then. If the item is purchased from our company, let's see, P for purchased from our company, it will have a gift receipt that allows for easy returns. So that's a G. If it's purchased, then there's a gift receipt. Since that watch was purchased from our company, okay, it's another P, right? The item is purchased from our company. It must have come with a gift receipt. Okay, gift receipt is G. And let's check that out. If P, then G. If it's purchased from the company, there's a gift receipt. The assertion of P, that is an item purchased from our company. And the application of the general rule, therefore, G. If it's purchased from our company, then there's a gift receipt. It was purchased from our company, therefore there must have been a gift receipt. All right, that looks a lot like our structure from the blurb. If R, then D. If P, then G. R, P, therefore D, therefore G. Looks like this might be our right answer, but let's go through the rest of them just in case. Even the hardest workers need a vacation now and then to relieve stress. Okay, that seems like maybe just one logical chunk there. Okay, let's say need a vacation, V. Vacations to sunny locations have been demonstrated to relieve the most stress. I mean, we could put S for stress here, but we can already see that this is not the right answer. There's no if-then statement. There's no application of an if-then statement to give us a conclusion. These are just kind of two statements that are just related to each other. That's not right. E. If our electrical bill becomes any higher, we will either need to move or else reduce our usage. Okay, I can already cross this one out too. Why? What in this first, I don't even have to read the rest of it. Think about for a second why I'm going to cross this one out right off the bat after reading this first sentence. What is in this sentence that is nowhere in our blurb? It's not this part here, the if, because the first part of our blurb is an if. What about over here, the second part? There's something there that's not in the blurb. Do you see it? It's a disjunction. Either or. This is something like, if our electric bill becomes any higher, then we will either need to move or reduce usage. But there are no disjunctions in our blurb. This can't be right. That's a whole different structural element. So this is out. A is out, B is out, D is out, E is out, C looks good, and it's the only one remaining. C is the correct answer, C. Now, quick note. Look how long this took us. These are tough questions. I mean, they're not always tough, but they usually require a bit of time. And it's hard, and you can't anticipate the answer the way you can in some other ones. So you really need to work through each and every answer choice, looking at the logical structure. It's kind of like doing 6 questions in one. So for that reason, I really recommend, and I always have when I was preparing for and taking the LSAT, I always saved these questions for last. I would just draw a circle around them on my first pass through, going through the LR section, and I'd come back later. I knew that I wasn't going to spend all my time on this question and risk missing other questions. They're all worth the same. So I figured I'll get to this one if I have time at the end, but I'm not going to waste too much time now. What if I get stuck on it? Then I might give up 2 or 3 or 4 easy questions that come after it. No way. So I do recommend saving your parallel structure or flaw questions for last. And almost always there's just 2 of them per section. You'll see them, they're huge, they take up like a half a page. Save them for last. And here is your homework for parallel structure, parallel flaw questions. Like I said, just about 2 per section. So go ahead and pause your video, take a screenshot, write it down, whatever you got to do. This is your homework for parallel structure, parallel flaw. Okay, strengtheners. These ones are pretty fun actually. This question type asks you to choose an answer that strengthens the argument presented in the blurb. And the basic strategy for strengtheners is going to be to find your conclusion first. Remember, we keep doing that. Find the conclusion first. Find the conclusion first because that's going to be the main point of the argument. And you can't know if an answer choice strengthens an argument unless you know what the main point of that argument is. So find the main point of the argument, the conclusion, and then look through the answer choices and see how they affect that conclusion. The right answer choice is going to make the conclusion more likely to be true, either because it provides additional support for the conclusion, because it reinforces existing support for the conclusion, or because it protects the conclusion from a potential challenge. And wrong answers will either weaken the argument overall, they'll be completely irrelevant, or they'll offer some strength but not as much as a better answer choice. And this last option, that's pretty rare. Usually there's something about the wording of that wrong answer that actually demonstrates that it's probably irrelevant, but it may seem like it's got a little bit of support. It is a possibility. Technically that could be what a wrong answer does, but usually that's not the case. And the last point on strategy for strengtheners, don't be too generous with the assumptions that you make when you're evaluating answer choices. Don't be generous to those answer choices. Don't try to make them right. Don't stretch your understanding of them and say, oh yeah, well it doesn't seem to support, but if this is true, then it could be supporting. If it's not written there, don't add it in. You really want the answer choice to offer some pretty direct support for the argument. Don't be too generous. These are guilty until proven innocent. So now, pause your video, try to do this one, and I will be back in just a second to walk you through it. Alright, read the question first. Which one of the following, if true, most strengthens the argument? Okay, we know we're looking for something that strengthens it. We are very confident that Mrs. Park is well prepared to exercise the duties that come with the office of the President. She served as governor of her home state for 3 terms and always had a positive approval rating. Alright, first we find the conclusion. You see what that is? It's that Mrs. Park is well prepared to exercise the duties that come with the office of the President. That's what this blurb is trying to convince you of. And the support for that is that Mrs. Park served as governor for a while and she had positive approval ratings. So the basic argument is Mrs. Park is well prepared to be the president because she was a governor and she had positive approval ratings when she was governor. Let's take a look at the answer choices. Which one of them strengthens this argument? A. Approval ratings usually track qualities in a candidate that are not actually related to job performance. Uh-oh. That would actually weaken the argument because the main support was these positive approval ratings, and you're telling me now in A that approval ratings are irrelevant to job performance. Okay, so that's a weakener. That can't be right. B, the largest city in the country is located in Mrs. Park's home state. Not so sure. I mean, I don't want to add too many assumptions, but I guess if she was a good governor for a lot of people, that would be some support. I'm not ready to knock that one out completely yet, but I don't really like it. C, many mayors go on to be successful governors. I mean, she wasn't a mayor. I guess it could show that one profession moves on to another profession in the world of politics, but that's pretty weak. D, no other governor of Mrs. Park's home state has maintained a positive approval rating for 3 terms. That just means she was a better governor than the other governors. That says nothing about president at all. It doesn't even help us at all. Or E, most of the duties of the president are very similar to the duties of a governor. Okay, well that links the governor and president well, um, because if she was a good governor, she might also be a good president. And furthermore, if that's not true, if the duties are completely different, then this argument wouldn't make sense at all. So it's actually pretty important. Let's go back and look at the other choices. The largest city in the country is located in Mrs. Park's home state. I mean, that I was really stretching with that one. Honestly, it could be the largest city, but it could be a mostly barren home state otherwise. I don't know. Like another. What was I even trying to do here? I was trying to say that this answer choice might indicate high population, but another state might have higher population because it's got a lot more smaller cities. So, I don't know. This one's just garbage. And C, many mayors go on to be successful governors. There was a tiny bit of support there, I guess, but this is about mayors going on to be governors. That's a different position. It has nothing to do with the presidency, and it definitely doesn't offer the same level of support as E does. So I'm going to cross that guy out. Let's go with E because it bridges the gap and tells us something very important. It says that this comparison that's being made between governor and president, the work done as a governor and the work that will be done as a president, is a proper comparison because the duties are similar. So E is your correct answer. It strengthens the conclusion, gives us more support for the conclusion that Mrs. Park is well prepared to exercise the duties that come with the office of the president. And here's your homework for strengtheners. Pause your video, take a screenshot, write it down, because we are moving along. Weakeners. These are a lot like strengtheners, except for the right answer choice is going to weaken the conclusion or the main point of the argument presented in the blurb. And wrong answers are either going to strengthen the argument, be completely irrelevant, or provide inferior weakening power relative to a different answer. Go ahead and pause your video, and I will be back in just a second to walk you through this one. Okay, which one of the following, if true, most weakens the argument? Okay, and the blurb. Some people worry that the recent increase in online shopping poses a threat to the environment. They cite as evidence the amount of packaging material required to deliver goods from warehouses to consumers. But nearly all of the packaging material is recyclable, so these worries are unfounded. Okay, so we're looking for the conclusion. We have a textual indication here of some conclusion, so these worries are unfounded. And yes, this is the conclusion of the entire argument. It's an interesting structure, though, because it's got 2 points of view. But we can tell by the way the language is here that the speaker is aligned with this point of view. Remember, some people, that's somebody else, but this point of view is the speaker. So the main point of this argument is that the worries that are had by some other people are actually unfounded. And why is that exactly? It's because what they're worried about is using a lot of packaging material, and that this might be bad for the environment, but this packaging material is recyclable, so don't worry about it. Okay, now we have to weaken this argument with one of the answer choices. Let's take a look. A. The rate of increase in online shopping has lessened in recent years. This doesn't strike me as a weakener at all. Mostly irrelevant, honestly. Maybe a tiny bit of actual strength. Maybe we should worry less if people aren't going to be using as much packaging material. It's still increasing. This is no good. This is the wrong answer. B. The process of recycling packaging material involves using significant amounts of energy derived from non-renewable natural resources. Okay, well, look at that. When we recycle, we're using a lot of energy still, and we're getting this energy from non-renewable natural resources. That sounds bad for the environment. And so B would be a weakener for this conclusion. Remember, the speaker in our blurb is saying, don't worry about it, we can recycle things. But this answer choice says, recycling is not a perfect solution. It's actually got some problems of its own. Okay, let's keep that one in bounds for a second. C. Today's consumers are more likely to recycle than were consumers in past decades. It's a comparison point about recycling. There's more recycling going on today. No, that's not a weakener. D. Warehouses ship most goods to large businesses. I can already feel myself trying to make assumptions for how this could make any sense at all and do something for us. It is not. No, definitely not as good as B. And E. Most scientists agree that global warming is occurring. Okay. No, that is not a weakener when compared to B, because this is a general statement about what's going on. It has nothing to do with recycling necessarily or online shopping. It would require, as with some of these other ones, just too many assumptions, too much work we'd have to do to try to make sense of it. Whereas B, which is our correct answer, is clearly related to what's going on in the argument, right? If the main support for the conclusion was that we can recycle packaging material and that was going to solve our problem, B weakens that idea. It weakens that support by saying, no, that recycling is not as good as you think it is. So B is your answer. And here is your homework for weakeners. So pause your video and take note of that. All right, flaw in the reasoning questions. These are pretty straightforward in terms of what they're asking you to do. You have to pick the answer choice that identifies some flaw or error, problem in the reasoning in the blurb, but these questions can still be kind of tough. In the next slide, I'm going to give you a list of common types of flaw. There's only a few types of flaw, and they just get recycled over and over. But what can make this question type difficult is the way that answer choices are often phrased. On the LSAT, the answer choices for flaw in the reasoning questions can often be phrased in very complicated, abstract language. So you might read through a blurb and you might see that something's clearly wrong with the argument. And you might even be able to describe what you see the problem as. But then you look at the answer choices and there's this, it's just like it's in a different language. It's all this abstract, complicated language, and it can be very difficult for people to understand what the answer choices even say, let alone to know if they describe the flaw that they've seen. So the challenge in preparing for these types of questions is learning to understand that complicated, abstract language. At first, all you can really do is slow it down, read each answer choice very carefully, word for word, and see if you can, you break it down into smaller chunks, understand what's being said, and then see if the answer choice matches up with your sense of what's wrong with the blurb. I mean, the answer choices, they're complicated, they're confusing, but they are accurate and they are precise. They just can be a little bit tough to understand. So stick with it, go slow at first. Now, pause your video for this one and try it on your own, and then I'll be back in a moment to walk you through it. Okay. The argument is vulnerable to criticism on the grounds that look, right there as an example. They could just say which of the following is a flaw in the argument, but no, we have to have the argument is vulnerable to criticism on the grounds that it. And who says this? Anyway, overly complicated, but it's what we have to deal with, so let's learn to deal with it. The blurb. Most physicists are good at performing calculations in their heads. Therefore, people who have this ability must be attracted to the study of physics. Okay, we start by finding the conclusion. Luckily, we have a textual indication here that shows us a conclusion is coming up. Therefore, Okay, so our conclusion here is, therefore, people who have the ability to perform calculations in their head must be attracted to the study of physics. And what's the support for that? Well, we see a lot of physicists who can do these calculations. Now, let's look at our answer choices and see which one describes a flaw in that reasoning. By the way, you can anticipate the flaw. You can read through something and be like, oh yeah, something's not quite right here. And you don't even need to look at the answer choices at first. You can just anticipate the flaw, but don't get too locked into your sense of what's wrong with it. One, because that closes your mind off to what might be a better answer, and two, like I said before, the wording might be so far from the way you describe it that you might overlook the correct answer because you're so locked into a particular way of describing it. So anticipate, but be flexible. Okay, answer choice A. These are now all choices for the things the argument might do that would be problematic. A. The argument fails to acknowledge that not every physicist is good at performing calculations in his or her head. I don't see how it does that. It doesn't say anything about... It says most physicists. It doesn't say anything about all physicists, and I mean, we don't need it to be every physicist in order to demonstrate this trend here. So no, I don't see how that's going on at all. B. The argument draws a general conclusion from one specific case. No, that's not going on either. That would be like if they said Smith is a physicist and he's good at calculations, therefore all physicists must be good at calculations. That's not going on here. C. The argument attacks the speaker's character instead of the argument. No, that's not going on at all. That's what's called an ad hominem attack, or like a personal attack. It's when you don't engage with the argument, but you instead go straight for the person who is saying the argument. You say something about their character. It's a typical flaw, but that's not going on here. D. The argument fails to consider that a person may become better at math as a result of studying physics. Okay, now that is interesting because there is a possibility here that that's the way this actually goes. The argument is making this claim that, people who already have the ability to do calculations must enter into the study of physics. They must enter the field, right? But it could be the other way around. People could enter the field for completely different reasons and not have this ability, and then gain the ability while they're studying physics. That kind of makes sense, and that would be problematic for this argument. So let's keep that one in for now. And let's take a look at E. The argument takes it for granted that performing calculations in one's head is the most important skill of a physicist. No, it doesn't say anything about most important. It just says that physicists are good at this. So D looks really good. Everyone else looks really bad. D is our answer. Okay. And as promised, here is a list of some common types of flaws that you're going to see on the LSAT. There are other ones, so don't take this as an exhaustive or complete list, but these are really common, and you'll see them in many different forms. But the basic types are problems between causation and correlation. That's what we just saw, right? We saw that two things come together, right? The fact that you can do calculations in your head and the fact that you're a physicist. Those two things happen at the same time. Those are found in the same people, and the argument makes a claim about which one caused the other one, right? But we don't really know. As we just saw, one could be the cause of the other, or it could be the complete opposite, right? The first thing could cause the second, or the second could cause the first. So this is often a problem that we can find in LSAT arguments. Second one, unwarranted assumptions. This is just when you look at an argument and you see the conclusion, you see the support for it, and you see that the argument requires a big assumption to link the support to the conclusion, but that assumption is not put out in the text, and there's no support, or there's no reason to make that assumption. So it just makes this unwarranted assumption behind the scenes. Shifting terms. This is when the argument has support for one sort of thing. Let's say that it was, the support was about biologists before, and then the conclusion was about physicists, or the support was about biologists and the conclusion was about all scientists, or something like that. Often there'll be a mismatch between support and conclusion in terms of a very slightly differing term, right? The support will be about one thing, the conclusion will be about a slightly different but related thing, and you're supposed to catch that. Attacking the source, I mentioned this one just a moment ago. This is when you attack the person making an argument instead of addressing the argument on its own grounds. So somebody says something and you say, "Oh, I'm not even going to listen to you because you're a liar and you're dishonest." Well, in the real world that happens all the time, but on the LSAT and technically speaking, that's not a proper way of responding to the argument. You want to take an argument on its merits, you want to look at the logic, you want to look at the support, and you want to attack the idea, not the person. And last one, parts and wholes. How to describe this one? This is when you make an inappropriate inference about something that's a whole because of one of its parts. So a very silly example would be a car's tires are made of rubber, and a car is partially made of tires, therefore car is made of rubber. Or something a little more complicated and abstract, a population is made up of people. People are made of cells, so populations are made of cells, like strange things like that. But you keep an eye out for situations in which they attribute the properties of a part of something to that whole thing, and there's an error that's going on there. And your homework for flaw in the reasoning, take a screenshot. As you can see, this is a pretty frequent question type. You see it a lot. Remember the necessary conditions we talked about last lesson? These were conditional statements with only if, and they described conditions that had to be in place if a certain outcome was to come about. Well, this is a similar question type. This is a question type that makes use of a similar idea. So this question type will ask you to look to the answer choices and find assumptions that must be made by the argument. It's an assumption that's absolutely necessary for the argument to be true. Not sufficient. Remember, we'll deal with sufficient assumptions in a moment. This is just an assumption that has to be true for the argument to go all the way through. A tricky thing about necessary assumption questions is that you really can't anticipate the answer to them. The reason for that is that there are actually countless necessary assumptions for any given argument. The reason is because it's only limited by your imagination. Believe it or not, I know it sounds a little strange, but it's true. So even if I have the simplest argument, like the sun is going to rise tomorrow in the morning because the sun has risen every morning so far, that there's a necessary assumption there. The assumption is that the world's not going to explode tomorrow or before the end of the day due to the Earth's core exploding. Another one that's just related, it's just going to be another one according to my imagination. It's going to be that the sun doesn't explode tomorrow. Another one's going to be that the Earth doesn't fly out of orbit and go to a different, fly into the dark space and be nowhere near the sun. There are all these assumptions that you can make for any argument that are required. They're all built in. They're never described or discussed because they're often really odd things like that, but they are there kind of working in the background. It's as strange as it sounds. So you can't really anticipate what the answer is going to be for these. Luckily, we have a little bit of a trick for you, and this is a foolproof method actually. It's called the negation test. So what you do is you take an answer choice that you're considering and you negate it. It's not the case that blah blah blah, whatever the answer choice is. Once you negate it, if the argument is destroyed, if the argument cannot work once you negate it, you know that you've stumbled upon a necessary assumption, right? Because we needed that to be true for the argument to work. So if you make it false, the argument's going to break down. That's how we know it's necessary. And one more pointer on necessary assumption questions. It's often the case that a wrong answer that's like seductive, that looks good, will be too strong. This is very common. So you might have an argument that is something like, Tom is very rich. therefore he is happy. And you might see an answer choice that says everybody who is rich is happy. Yeah, if you assume that, the argument works. It's a sufficient condition, but it's not necessary because it's too strong. It's about people other than Tom. The argument's not assuming things about people other than Tom. So what you really want there, if the argument is Tom is very rich, therefore he is very happy, what you really want is the fact that Tom is very rich makes him very happy. That's the assumption that's going on there. It's limited just to the stuff that's discussed in the argument. So be careful of answers that are too strong. Anyway, use the negation test for necessary assumption questions, especially in the beginning before you get that intuition that allows you to just kind of see it somehow. That's really something that we're going for in a lot of question types, eventually having the intuition to not have to use these tests, but at the beginning it's helpful to have a technique. So again, you negate the answer choice. If the argument's destroyed, you've stumbled on a necessary assumption. Go ahead and pause your video now and try out the negation test. Take a look at this argument and see if you can find the necessary assumption. Okay, let's take a look. Which of the following is an assumption on which the argument depends? Okay, tells us we're doing necessary assumptions. The government of country F will soon be far less repressive. Access to the internet provides citizens with an effective way of discovering secrets that allow governments to control the citizenry, and country F recently experienced a widespread increase in internet accessibility. Okay, so the conclusion is the first sentence. The rest of it is support. This thing about the internet is going to lead to the government of country F being less repressive. Sounds great. Okay, answer choices. And we're going to use the negation test. So the answer choice A. Government officials in country F institute repressive policies because they believe them to be good for the citizens. Do we need that to be the case? Let's try negating it. It's not the case that government officials in country F institute repressive policies because they believe them to be good for the citizens. So we're saying something about their bad motives. It says nothing about what's going to happen when the internet comes around, so the motive that they have really doesn't matter. B. Every time a country experiences a widespread increase in internet accessibility, the country's government becomes less repressive. Well, that would help the argument, I guess, because it would tell us that what's happened in other countries, I guess, would also happen here, but let's negate it. It's not the case that every time a country experiences a widespread increase in internet accessibility, the country's government becomes less oppressive. Now, that didn't do it. That didn't destroy it, because we've said it's not the case that every time, right? We know that B is not the right answer because it's about more than just this particular country in this situation. So the argument doesn't need to assume something about every time. Okay, moving on, looking for that necessary assumption. C. The government of country F will not censor the content available to its citizens over the internet in such a way that makes it impossible for citizens to discover secrets. Now, is that necessary? Let's negate it. It's not the case that the government of country F will not censor the content. So we have a double negative there. So we can just make that into a positive, and that ends up being that the government of country F will censor the content available to its citizens over the internet in such a way that makes it impossible for citizens to discover secrets. Okay, once we negate that and we have the government censoring the internet, that is really bad for this argument, right? Because the argument relies on a certain feature of internet accessibility, or a certain thing that's going to happen once people have the internet. They're going to be able to discover secrets. But if they're going to have the internet, but it's going to be a censored internet, that's not going to happen. And then the argument will not work. So that's looking pretty good. Let's take a look at the other ones, though. D. In addition to helping citizens uncover government secrets, access to the internet also helps a country's businesses expand. Okay, it's not the case that access to the internet also helps a country's businesses expand. That doesn't do anything for the argument. That doesn't challenge it at all. And E, increasing access by citizens to the internet is the only way of protecting them against repression by their government. Too strong, I can see it already, but use the negation test. It's not the case that increasing access by citizens to the internet is the only way Maybe there are other ways, right? But the argument is definitely not assuming, or doesn't have to assume, that this is the only way that the citizens can be protected from repression. That is too strong. It's not being assumed here. But this here, C, the fact that the government's not going to censor anything, that is assumed in this argument. We need that to be true in order for this argument to work. And your homework for necessary assumption questions, go ahead and take a screenshot. And sufficient assumption questions. So somewhat related to what we just did with necessary assumption, but it's a different question type. In this case, you're going to be asked to find an answer choice that bridges a gap between the support and the conclusion of the argument in the blurb. There's going to be some kind of mismatch, some kind of gap between the support and the conclusion, and you have to fill that. Now, it's often a change in terminology. Something about the support will be about one thing, and the conclusion will be about something slightly different, and you have to bridge the gap between those two things. And also, unlike with necessary assumptions, it's okay for the answer choice, the correct answer choice in sufficient assumptions, to be very strong. Right before it was problematic with necessary assumptions, but here you're just trying to fill a gap, and if you overfill a gap, that's fine, because even if something is more than good enough to guarantee the result, it's still going to be good enough to guarantee the result, right? So don't worry about strength on this one. That's a problem with necessary assumptions. And another thing that you should keep in mind is it can be somewhat limiting if you adopt the mindset that you have to agree with these arguments. You might see a gap in the argument, and then you try to fill it with one of the answer choices, and you just don't like the argument, so you feel like it's not complete, or there's something wrong with it. You really need to turn that part of your brain off. This is about logical structure and making the argument flow logically. So don't worry about if you agree or not with the argument that's presented. Just make the argument work on its own terms, logically. Okay, give this a shot on your own. Pause the video, and I'll be back in a moment to walk you through it. Okay, the argument's conclusion follows logically if which of the following is assumed. Despite what he says, the new congressman is not concerned with the views of his constituents. Since being elected 11 months ago, he has not held a single town hall meeting. Okay. So this bit about the town hall meetings is used to support this idea that he's not concerned with the views of his constituents. So this is your conclusion. And do you see a gap between this bit about town hall meetings and being concerned? One of the support talks about the kind of meetings he's holding or failing to hold, and the conclusion is about his state of mind. Now, you might make that jump immediately, but it's not about the exact same thing, so there's a bit of a gap there. Let's see which answer choice fills that gap. A. The congressmen who were best known for being concerned with the views of their constituents held regular town hall meetings. Okay, that doesn't help us out here, really. It's about other congressmen. We need something about this congressman. B. Holding town hall meetings is the only way a congressman can gauge the views of his constituents. That could be true, but it doesn't tell us that he's not concerned. So he might be unable to gauge the views of his constituents because he's not holding any town halls. That doesn't tell us he's not concerned, though. Maybe he really wants to hold a town hall, he just hasn't yet. So this, even if it's true, doesn't get us all the way through. C. Any congressman who fails to hold at least one town hall meeting is not concerned with the views of his constituents. Okay, now that gets us to two parts of the gap, right? The failure to hold a meeting and the concern, and it links those two. And yes, it's too strong, any congressman, but like I said, being too strong is not a problem here because we just add this to the information here. If it's too too good. If it's more than enough, that's fine because it's still good enough. So this is looking pretty good. It links his failure to hold a town hall to his state of mind, which was the gap we found. D. Most of the congressman's constituents have little concern for public affairs. No, that doesn't get us from the town halls to the mindset. And E. During his campaign, the congressman promised to hold regular town hall meetings if elected. Oh, and he didn't do it. Surprise. But it's unfortunate for his constituents, but that doesn't bridge the gap between his activities and his state of mind. C is your answer. It's too strong, but it is strong enough. And your homework for sufficient assumption questions. Take note of it. All right, inference questions. These ones they can be pretty tricky, and they're pretty prevalent as well, so you got to get a hang for them. What an inference question asks you to do is read through the blurb and then pick an answer choice that follows from what is written in the blurb. Something that can be concluded on the basis of what is written in the blurb. It's something that has to be true or that comes after what's written in the blurb, logically speaking. And in that way, it's sort of similar to a necessary assumption question insofar as it's got to be true, right? The answer's got to be true, and the necessary assumption had to be true. But where they differ is that the necessary assumption questions asked you to find an answer that needed to be true in order for the argument in the blurb to work. Whereas in an inference question, the blurb is going to be fine already. You just need to you need to find something that is going to be true following that argument that's already fine. So you should be thinking about inference questions as you're looking for something that's supported by or following logically what you've said so far in the blurb. And you can use a modified so test for the answers. You can read through the blurb and then say so, and then try an answer choice and see if it functions that way. And inference questions will come in two varieties, what we could call a heavy and a light variety. And those will be respectively, it'll ask you which of the following must be true given what was said so far, and that's the heavy version, or the light version, which of the following is most strongly supported by what you've said so far, right? So the difference is between heavy, must be true, and light, most strongly supported. This latter one, most strongly supported, it's sort of like a backward strengthener. The argument in the blurb will serve as a strengthener for the answer choice. But the first one, the heavy version, which of the following must be true, is a lot more demanding. It's a lot more exacting. So you have to be careful of your language with those. You have to think of them as looking for something that is absolutely necessary given what you've said so far. And so just like with necessary assumptions, you have to make sure that if the question is asking what must be true, the answer choice can't be too strong, because what has to be true given the argument in the blurb is likely to be pretty limited. So you want to make sure that your answer choice is not too strong. Okay, so pause the video and try to see which answer choice here follows logically from what is given in the blurb. And I will be back to walk you through this question in just a second. Alright, if the statements above are all true, which of the following must also be true? So we're dealing with a heavy version, right? Must also be true. Alright, let's take a look. Philosophy has no immediate application to life outside of academia. Studying philosophy is personally fulfilling, but majoring in the discipline will not help a student secure employment after college. Nevertheless, many students choose each year to pursue a major in philosophy. This is a bunch of baloney, this question. I majored in philosophy, and I'm doing fine. But we can't argue with the arguments. We have to take them as they are and look at them on their own merits, so I'll just leave it alone for now. Okay, so I'm looking for the conclusion here. I'm not really seeing anything. It's a little bit odd, this one. Philosophy has no immediate application to life outside of academia. I guess that sort of supports the idea that it could be hard to secure employment. Nevertheless, many students choose each year to pursue a major in philosophy. Remember I said earlier that the blurb often presents an argument? This is one of those odd cases where it doesn't really present an argument, it just kind of tells you some information or gives you a few statements. And I think that that's most likely to be the case on inference questions because you don't really need an argument in order to make an inference. You can make an inference from a number of statements, and that's kind of what's going on here. So while I think there could be an argument made that there's a conclusion here and we could kind of orient the other information around that conclusion and call it support or background information, I'm going to just leave this one alone. I'm going to say there's no conclusion here, but I'm going to take these statements and try to see what follows from them. Okay, A. A major that cannot help a student secure employment after college is not worth pursuing. Okay, again, we're looking for something that must be true. It doesn't say anything about what's not worth pursuing in this argument. That language is sort of out of bounds. Yeah, we can't say anything about what's worth pursuing. That concept's not even in the blurb, so we can't say that that must be true. B. At least some students are not motivated by the idea of making a lot of money. This is a little bit fishy also because this idea of making a lot of money, that's kind of a little trick the LSAT likes to do where they take one thing, which here is securing employment, and they twist it. They turn it into something similar, but not actually identical, which is making a lot of money. The idea of making a lot of money is actually not in this argument at all, so I'm going to reject this one as well. Or not this argument, this set of statements. C. It is because philosophy has no immediate application to life outside of academia that majoring in it will not help a student secure employment after college. Well, that doesn't have to be true. No, that's an extra bit of information that doesn't have to be true. D. More students would major in philosophy if it would help them secure employment after college. I don't know if that could be true, but it doesn't have to be true given what is said in the argument. That's wrong. Oh man, I hope E is right because otherwise we're in trouble. At least one activity that has no immediate application to life outside of academia is nevertheless personally fulfilling. Okay, so a lot of elements that were in the statements, that's promising, right? At least one activity that's referring to philosophy, doing philosophy, that has no immediate application to life outside of academia, that's this, is nevertheless personally fulfilling. Well, we see that there's an activity here that has no immediate application to life outside of academia, and that same activity is stated as personally fulfilling. Okay, so this is a link that we actually can make given what is in the blurb here. So that's your right answer. It must be true, and you can see it's pretty careful about the language. At least one activity. If it said at least two activities, this would be no good because we only have evidence for one activity, doing philosophy. So answer E is the correct inference to be drawn from the statements in the blurb. And lots of practice for the inference questions. Take note of it. Alright, we are almost finished. Just this and one more question type left. Apply the principal questions. This one's pretty straightforward. The blurb is going to give you a principle given in general language, and you're going to have to see if it applies to a specific case. Think about that for a second. Take a general rule and see if it applies in a specific case. On a law school exam? Go figure. Now, there's another version of the apply the principle question, and that's when the principle is implied. It's a little bit trickier. So the blurb will have a specific situation itself, and you have to look at the principle that's operating beneath the surface, pull it out, and then see which of the answer choices is also operating in accordance with that principle. That's not the one we have here, though. This is just a regular old apply the principle. So pause your video and try to apply the principle in the blurb to the answer choices and see which one most closely conforms to it. Alright, here we go. Which one of the following judgments most closely conforms to the principle above? Okay, let's check out the principle above. An action is praiseworthy when it has positive consequences and the actor intended to produce those consequences. An action is blameworthy when the actor intends to produce harmful consequences, whether or not those consequences come to pass. Okay, here's another example, by the way, of a blurb that has no conclusion. This is just a general rule. And it's actually kind of laying out definitions for us, right? We know when something is praiseworthy, we know that when something is blameworthy, and now we can use these definitions in the specific situations to see which one most closely conform to the principle. So let's look at answer choice A. Jared should not be blamed for trying to rob the bank. Nobody was hurt, and he was arrested before he had the chance to steal anything. Okay, so this is about part of the principles, about the blameworthy stuff. And the actor intends to produce harmful consequences. If the actor intends to produce harmful consequences, it's blameworthy, whether or not those consequences come to pass. So this bit here is saying that even though he was trying to rob the bank, there's the intention, nothing bad happened, and the consequences didn't come to pass. But that's not what the principle says. We blame them even if the consequences don't come to pass. B. Mikey should be blamed for trying to steal Tracy's valuables, even though he could not find the safe and fled before the police arrived at the house. Yeah, looks like that kind of succeeds where A failed. Remember, the intention to produce the harmful consequences, right? Trying to steal Stacy's valuables is all we need to blame something. So Mike didn't succeed, but he did want to do something bad. So it looks like pretty blameworthy to me, according to this principle. C. Carl should be praised for helping Melvin study for the exam, even though Melvin ended up failing. Well, what's our rule for praiseworthiness? It's praiseworthy when it has positive consequences and the actor intended to produce those consequences. So those are two things that have to happen for something to be praiseworthy. Well, this didn't have positive consequences, so it might be that it's praiseworthy, but not according to this principle, right? This just gives us two sufficient conditions, a combination that's sufficient. It has to have positive consequences, and the actor has to have intended those. But that's not a situation we're talking about here, because there were no positive consequences, so we don't really know if it's praiseworthy or not. D. Coach Bill should be praised for reaching out to the parents regarding Stephen's absences. Most coaches would have just cut Stephen's playing time. We don't know about the positive consequences. We don't know about the intention. We don't know if these sufficient conditions are met. We can't really make claims about praiseworthiness with Coach Bill. E. Timothy should be blamed for spilling wine on the carpet. It will be impossible to remove the stain, and the carpet is one of a kind. Well, we need to know about the intentions of somebody to know whether we blame them, and this doesn't actually refer to his intentions. It doesn't say if it's an accident or if he just turned his hand over and poured wine all over the place. So just because it's impossible to remove the stain and the carpet is one of a kind, those aren't the kinds of things that we're worried about when figuring out blameworthiness according to this principle. So that one's out too. B is your answer. It most closely conforms to the principle above. And your homework for apply the principle questions. As you can see, there aren't too many of them. It's a fairly uncommon question type. But take note of it anyway. All right, last one. Congratulations on making it this far. These are unexpected result questions. They're pretty straightforward. I don't have a whole lot to say about this question type. The blurb is going to present to you an odd situation. You're going to read through it, and given what's said, you're going to expect something to happen, but something else is going to happen. And then you have to pick the answer choice that reconciles this problem, that makes sense of this odd situation. So let's jump right into this one. Pause your video, read through the read the question, read through the blurb, try to make sense of this odd situation, and then I will be right back to help you through it. Okay, which one of the following, if true, contributes to a resolution of the discrepancy above? Let's check out that discrepancy. Even up until the day before the election, Carl Smith led Donahue in the polls by a significant margin. Nevertheless, when the ballots were counted, Donahue emerged victorious. Now that is a little odd, isn't it? Carl Smith was leading the polls the whole time, so we'd expect him to win. Yet, when it came right down to it, Donahue emerged victorious. Now we have to find an answer choice that makes sense of this oddity. Answer choice A. Most polls are administered by institutions whose board members have strong political interests. Well, that doesn't really do anything for us. It doesn't say whose interests they have in mind. It doesn't say which candidate they prefer or anything. It doesn't really help us. B. Donahue never used personal attacks against his opponent while campaigning, while Carl Smith ran many negative ads. I mean, that's great for Donahue. Maybe the voters liked that, but it should have showed up in the polls. This doesn't explain why the polls are out of line with the actual results. C. Some politicians have in the past emerged victorious even though they always trailed in the polls. That's fine, but we want to know why that happened, how that happened. The fact that it's happened other times, other odd situations don't help us gain clarity with regard to this one, so that's no good. D. Most polls are administered via phone calls to people's homes during work hours, and many more working people supported Donahue than did Carl Smith. Okay, this one's about polls. Let's see here. The polls are administered during work hours, and a lot of the people who are working, okay, they're calls to people's homes during work hours, and many more working people supported Donahue than Carl Smith. This looks pretty interesting, because if the polls said that Carl Smith was leading, but that's because the pollsters never talked to a lot of Donahue supporters who were at work when the phone call came at home, that would be a reason why the polls would be inaccurate. Okay, this one does contribute to a resolution of this odd situation. Let's take a look at E. Carl Smith ran for the same position in the past and lost that as well. Doesn't say anything about the polls, doesn't help us out in the slightest. All right, this bit about the working hours. This helps us figure out the odd situation. It helps bridge the gap between the expected and the unexpected. And your last batch of homework problems for unexpected result questions. Pause your video, take a screenshot. Congratulations on making it through. That is it for lesson 3. Pretty comprehensive introduction to the logical reasoning section. We went through all the different major question types. You've got lots of homework. Remember, it's a good idea to do the homework in the chunks that they were presented, right? Do a ton of inference questions in a row. Do a ton of necessary assumption questions in a row so that you really get a hang for that type of question type. And then, a big challenge is just identifying the question type. Seeing all the different ways that a question can be asked. Ideally, you want to be in a place where you are going through the logical reasoning section and you first glance at the question and very quickly you know exactly what your task is. You don't even have to really read the question. You just know what your task is. You bounce up to the blurb, you read it in a very focused manner, and you go to work. At more advanced stages, you'll be able to anticipate answers to questions more easily. You'll be building your intuition, but this all comes with a lot of practice and a lot of drilling of these kind of questions. So drill them by question types, and don't underestimate the power of review. When you're doing this homework, don't just go through it and say I got the right answer and move along. Really look closely at each answer the way we did in this lesson and understand why the wrong answers are wrong, why the right answer is right, and if you get it wrong, why did you get it wrong? What tricked you? Is there any pattern to the questions that are tripping you up? Is there any pattern to the questions that you're really good at? Try to look for all this extra information when you're studying. This will help you to succeed, and it'll help you to progress instead of just blindly practicing. So, best of luck to you in preparing for the logical reasoning section. Next up is lesson 4, and we're going to start on the analytical reasoning section. There'll be 2 lessons on that because it's pretty complicated, but these are the logical games sections. So I look forward to playing some logical games with you guys. I will see you there.